Bienvenidos y bienvenidas todos. Nos encontramos en el último seminario de economía del año del BCRA. En este caso nos visita virtualmente Lilian Rolim de la Universidad de Campinas, Brasil. Lilian tiene un PhD en economía de la Universidad de Campinas. También obtuvo un máster en Economía de la Universidad de Campinas y un máster en Economía Internacional y Finanzas de la Universidad de París 13. Y su investigación se focaliza en la relación entre la distribución del ingreso, la actividad económica y los instrumentos de política económica, y también en el estudio de economías abiertas. Lilian es coordinadora del Keynesian Economics Working Group del Young Scholar Initiative de INET. El trabajo que va a estar presentando Lilian se titula Evidencia empírica del principio de compensación en la economía brasileña, 2004 a 2011, y lo va a estar comentando Pedro Rosegui, uno de nuestros investigadores de la Gerencia Principal de Estudios Económicos del BCRA. Como hacemos siempre, la expositora en este caso va a tener entre 30 y 35 minutos para hacer su presentación. Luego el discussant, Pedro, va a tener unos 15 minutos más o menos para dar su comentario al paper, y luego abrimos para una ronda de preguntas del resto de los participantes del seminario. Dicho eso, ahora cambiamos al inglés, que va a ser el idioma en el cual vamos a conducir la actividad. So I switch to English. Lilian, I thank again for your participation in our economic seminars. The floor is yours. You have around 30-35 minutes for your presentation, and then we'll have the discussion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Herma. Thank you also for the invitation and for everybody being here, Pedro for commenting, and Ariel for organizing this. So I will share my screen, just 1 second. And if there are any issues, please let me know. To begin with, this is a paper co-authored with my colleagues from the University of Campinas and from the University of São Paulo. The presentation is based on the paper that was published at the Cambridge Journal of Economics. So there is a slight change in terms of the methodology used, but the results, the discussion, everything is the same as the paper that will be uploaded for this seminar. So the title of the presentation is Empirical Evidence of the Compensation Principle in the Brazilian Economy from 2004 to 2011. So what was the motivation of this work? Well, I think everybody here knows that in the 2000s, many developing countries were kind of benefited from a commodity boom, which was then reinforced by a capital flows to those countries, and therefore they could accumulate a substantial amount of foreign reserves. So there were these entries of foreign reserves in those countries, and in order to prevent the exchange rate from appreciating too much, the central banks intervened in the exchange market, and they were acquiring those reserves, and therefore the stock of foreign reserves held by those countries increased substantially in that period. Well, if we take the conventional view about what are the consequences of this process, usually it's considered that such interventions will restrict the monetary policy autonomy. So we will explain a bit more of this in the next slides, but there would be a link between intervening in the foreign exchange market and having monetary policy autonomy. And therefore, the interventions that were undertaken in this period would have been a problem in terms of monetary policy autonomy. What we will see in terms of the compensation view is that there is an alternative interpretation to this relationship, and not necessarily intervening in the foreign exchange market restricts the monetary policy autonomy that a country has. So given this motivation, our aim in this paper is twofold. So first, we want to present the compensation view as an alternative to both the Trilemma View and the more recent Dilemma View, which is even more restricted than the Trilemma View. And in this sense, this is more a theoretical discussion that we are trying to build based on previous works on this topic as well. Then we move to the empirical part of the paper, which is to provide evidence in favor of the compensation principle in Brazil in the 2000s. So this is more the empirical part of the paper. So first of all, I think it's important to define what is the compensation principle. Well, basically the compensation principle is the extension of the concept of endogenous money, here endogenous money being demand-led, and exogenous interest rate being the interest rate set by the central bank. So it's the extension of these concepts to an open economy analysis. So what does this mean? Basically, let's assume that there are forex inflows to a certain country. Well, if the central bank wants to maintain a fixed exchange rate, it will intervene in the foreign exchange market and buy those reserves in order to reduce the amount of reserves that are being negotiated and therefore keep the stability of the exchange rate. By doing so, it will increase the reserve balances of the private banks in the system. And here is where this kind of idea of endogenous money plays a role, because the banks will see themselves with reserves that don't earn any interest. And since they have already granted all the credit that they considered credit worthy, so they previously evaluated those the credit worthiness of their clients, and the credit demand that was considered credit worthy was already fulfilled, banks will see themselves with reserves that they don't need, and it's not as if they are going to lend reserves. This is not how credit is, how it works. Actually, it's by granting credit that they create deposits. So they will have reserves that don't earn any interest, and they can either buy assets from the central bank and then receive an interest payment. This is the case of an asset-based economy, or they can repay their debt with the central bank and therefore reduce the interest payments that they would have to make to the central bank. So they will use those reserves and get rid of them because they can either profit for them or reduce the payments that they have related to their debt. So what are the implications of this? Well, in a fixed exchange rate regime, this means that sterilization is automatic as long as the central bank is committed to maintaining the interest rate at the targeted level. So basically, the central bank will accept the purchase of those assets by the banks or the repayment of the debt, as I showed in the previous slide, because they want to keep the interest rate at their targeted level. So central banks here have a defensive position. And this means that also this sterilization process is going to happen at the initiative of the private sector. It's not a sterilization policy. It's just something that is automatic and happens every time that the banks see themselves with reserves that don't earn any interest. So this is basically the main conclusion from the compensation principle. What this means is that foreign exchange flows will alter the composition of the central bank's balance sheet, but they do not change the monetary base because the banks will see themselves with those reserves, and then those reserves will be used to acquire assets or reduce liabilities. So, so this means also that the type of exchange rate regime will not constrain the ability of the central bank to set the short-term interest rate because there won't be a change in the monetary base. And therefore, if there are any constraints, they are more of political nature, and we will discuss a bit this further, but it's not in terms of a technical constraint itself. Nevertheless, we do need to recognize that while surpluses in the balance of payments can go forever and the central bank can keep acquiring those foreign reserves that are entering the countries, there is an obvious limit to deficits because the central banks have a certain amount of foreign reserves. However, when they run into having exhausting their foreign reserves, it's not as if the compensation principle doesn't apply anymore. It's just that the peg will have to be broken. So the compensation principle is very robust even to those cases. It's just that when the central bank doesn't have any reserves any longer, it will have to accept a flexible exchange rate regime, at least in that situation. So the idea of the compensation principle still holds, but of course there is an asymmetry on its relevance to different situations in terms of the balance of payments. So now to the theoretical debate that is presented in the paper. So as I said, the relationship between forex interventions and monetary policy is analyzed in the more conventional view by the trilemma, and more recently, the dilemma. However, what we want to show is that the compensation view offers an alternative to both of these approaches. So here it's important to mention that the compensation view there are many papers by Lavoie that who's discussing it. Basically, those discussions were targeting the trilemma view. What we want to do in the paper, which is somehow a contribution to start this debate, is to also think critically about the dilemma view in terms of the compensation view. And of course, I think this is a debate that is still it can improve still, but our paper is trying to show where and how the compensation view offers an alternative also to the dilemma. But we start with the Monoflaming model. So the Monoflaming model is based on these two assumptions. And the main conclusion is that a fixed exchange rate regime will constrain the monetary policy effectiveness. So here the term being used is effectiveness, which means a sustainable effect on the level of income. So if we assume a fixed exchange rate regime, the Monoflaming model would say that when there is an expansionary monetary policy, there is an increase in the monetary base. This leads to a reduction of the interest rate relative to the international interest rate. And this will create pressures for devaluation because there will be somehow a capital outflows. However, these capital outflows will have to be counteracted by the central bank, who will sell foreign exchange reserves in order to keep the exchange rate fixed. By doing so, the central bank will be debiting reserves balances in the bank's accounts. This reduces the monetary base, and therefore the interest rate goes back to the international level. So the interest rate increases, and this process stops when the interest rate is back to the international level. So in this case, there isn't a sustainable effect on the interest rate, and there is no effect on real variables such as GDP or exports. So in this view, based on the Monoflaming, we have the monetary base and money supply responding endogenously to changes in the foreign reserves. So this is a type of endogeneity, but it's different from the one from the compensation principle because it's a supply-led endogeneity. The fact that there are more reserves then leads to an endogeneity in the monetary base because it's responding to that. Also, there is somehow an exogenous interest rate, but it is exogenous because it's set by the international conditions. It's not exogenous in the sense of the compensation principle, which was that it was set by the central bank. And the only alternative that the central bank has in this case to control the monetary base would be to perform sterilized interventions. So the view here is that it would be at the central bank's initiative to start a sterilization process, which would then allow it to control the monetary base. However, this is seen as very little effective and not really an option. So different from the compensation view here, it is considered that most forex interventions are unsterilized because if sterilization is not so welcome and not so effective. Whereas in the compensation view, sterilizations would be automatic and happen every time that banks see themselves with reserves that they don't want because they don't earn any interest. In a flexible exchange rate regime, what would happen is that, again, an expansionary monetary policy would reduce the interest rate relative to the international level. However, in this case, the central bank would allow those capital outflows to depreciate the domestic currency, and therefore the exchange rate would increase. Such a change in the exchange rate would then stimulate exports and therefore stimulate output. And the increase in output would increase the demand for money in the economy, and the interest rate would go back again to the international level. So again, the process stops when the interest rate is back at the international level. However, there is an important difference. Since the exchange rate is allowed to depreciate, this leads to a stimulus to exports, and therefore the monetary policy does have an effect on real variables. So this is the key difference in terms of how the Monoflaming model sees the flexible and the fixed exchange rate regimes. And by definition, if the mechanism is through an exchange rate, if you have a fixed exchange rate regime, you kill this mechanism by definition, right? So the centrality of the effect of monetary policy on the real variables is through the exchange rate in the Monoflaming model. The Monoflaming model was then used to create this Trilemma View, which is slightly different in terms of the concepts being used. So the main idea of the Trilemma View is that the monetary authorities can choose only 2 out of 3 policy options: free capital mobility, control over the exchange rate, and independent monetary policy guided towards domestic objectives. Here, an independent monetary policy is defined as the ability to drive local interest rates away from the world rate. So here, independence of the monetary policy is a bit closer to the concept that we were discussing with respect to the compensation thesis, because it's the control over the interest rate. And basically, the conclusion here is that if there are free capital flows, so no capital controls, the central bank will have to choose between controlling the exchange rate or controlling the interest rate. It cannot do both in this view. And as we saw, the compensation principle will offer the opposite conclusion, saying that even if you control the exchange rate, since there is not a change in the monetary base, you can still control the interest rate. So you could still have an independent monetary policy in these terms. Also, in the Trilemma View, sterilization is still seen as ineffective and insufficient to break the link between exchange rates and monetary policy when we have a fixed exchange rate regime. So again, here sterilization is seen as something that you cannot really rely upon, whereas in the compensation view, it's seen as something automatic that will happen every time that there is an intervention in the foreign exchange market. More recently, this debate has been framed in a different way, and the main author who was contributing to this discussion was Elaine Ray, and she argues that the trilemma has morphed into a dilemma due to financial globalization. So her main argument is that the ever-increasing capital flows constrain monetary policy regardless of the floating exchange rate regime. So here we can see that she's criticizing directly one of the conclusions from the Trilemma View. And our idea in this part of the paper was to try to understand better her arguments and then see whether there is a contrast between what she says and what would be the case if we look from it from the compensation view point of view. So basically, in the dilemma view, sterilizations are still seen as not really something that central banks should rely upon. So what she says is that when the central bank intervenes in the forex markets, it leads to a trade-off of higher inflation or increased sterilization costs, with a likely side effect of increased interest rates leading to further inflows. So how can we interpret this quote from Ray? Well, first, she seems to be accepting a link between forex inflows and inflation, which is really a Monoflaming feature. So basically, the idea here is that if there is no sterilization, there will be an increase in money supply, and this increase in money supply will lead to inflation. So here, not only we have this quantitative theory of money saying that increases in money supply lead to increases in the inflation rate, but also it's assumed that sterilization is not automatic, and therefore those foreign exchange operations will lead to an increase in money supply. So if we take the compensation view, this link between the foreign exchange interventions and the monetary base would not apply. And also, if we have a different view on how inflation is determined, even if there were an increase in money supply, not necessarily we would observe higher inflation rates. Something also which is interesting in this case is that it seems that Ray is seeing sterilization as causing increases in the interest rate, whereas from the compensation view, the idea is that sterilization will actually be triggered by inflows that follow the changes in the interest rate. So actually the causality seems to be reversed in the way that Ray is seeing the role played by sterilization, and the way that the compensation view sees the sterilization. In terms of the main conclusions of the dilemma view, from the papers and what is being said in the papers, it seems that with respect to the fixed exchange rate regime, the view is exactly the same as the trilemma view. And the mechanism is the same. It seems to be through money supply. And the conclusion is that there is a lack of monetary policy autonomy because the central bank cannot control the interest rate when it intervenes in the foreign exchange market. So here it doesn't seem so much different from the trilemma view. What it seems to be new in the dilemma view is the inclusion of a credit rationing discussion, which is based on new Keynesian features. So the idea is that large financial flows can raise asset prices and therefore reduce agency costs that are imposed by information asymmetry. And this process would lead to credit growth that is not prevented from floating exchange rate. So in terms of a floating exchange rate regime, what we have is that the effect of the domestic monetary policy will be limited and associated with the monetary policy in the USA because of the huge capital flows that can be related to changes in the monetary policy in this central economy. However, it seems that it's a different concept of monetary policy independence or autonomy, because in the first point related to the fixed exchange rate regime, it seems to be the concept that was being used by the trilemma, which is being able to keep the interest rate at the level that the central bank decides. Whereas when it's in terms of the flexible exchange rate regime, the concept seems to be broader, including also credit conditions and other monetary policy aspects. So not only focused on the interest rate. And this is also suggested by these two quotes from Ray's paper. So in 2015, she says that in the dilemma, independent monetary policies are possible if and only if the capital account is managed, directly or indirectly, regardless of the exchange rate regime. So here it seems very clear that she's criticizing the way that the trilemma was dealing with the idea of independent monetary policy, which, as I said, was regarding the setting of the interest rate itself. Nevertheless, in a 2016 paper, what Ray says is that the trilemma misleads us by assuming that domestic monetary and financial conditions shaping the macroeconomic situation of a country can be conveniently summarized by this one single variable, the short-term interest rate. So here it's quite clear that she's actually saying that monetary conditions are way broader than the short-term interest rate, and that the international conditions can affect the monetary conditions in a broader sense. Obviously, it becomes very hard to compare the dilemma view with the trilemma if the concept is changing. And this also makes it harder to compare the dilemma view with the compensation view, because for the compensation view, there is a very precise concept of monetary policy of autonomy, whereas in the dilemma view, this is much broader and not so well defined. So this difference in the concepts of monetary policy independence make it harder to have a clear-cut answer as to what are the differences between the dilemma view and the compensation principle. And in this sense, there's also a colleague of ours who's trying to define better this concept of monetary policy independence, Natalie Marins. This is part of her PhD. So this is one area of research that could benefit a lot from having more precise terms. But what we could, from our paper, kind of conclude is that if we were to say what is the main contrast between the dilemma view and the compensation view, it seems to be related to how credit is granted. So it seems that Elaine Ray is still following this idea that credit growth depends on supply conditions. Whereas in the endogenous money approach, which is the basis for the compensation principle, it would depend more on the demand for credit. So this seems to be the main contrast between the two views. So to conclude this more theoretical part, we conclude that neither the trilemma nor the dilemma are the most appropriate way to understand the relationship between foreign exchange interventions and monetary policy. it seems that the dilemma is challenging the trilemma with respect to the flexible exchange rate regime, whereas the conclusions for the fixed exchange rate regime seems to be the same. But it doesn't seem that the dilemma is challenging the compensation principle. If we take into consideration the new elements that are being brought by the dilemma view, they are not questioning the conclusions that were emphasized by the compensation principle, which defines monetary policy autonomy as the ability to set the interest rate. So if we take this very technical definition of monetary policy autonomy, it seems that it's robust regardless of the new contributions that were brought by this dilemma view discussion. I'm sorry, there's some mistake here. But what is kind of new from the dilemma view is to highlight the influence of political and international determinants on the interest rate that is set by the central bank, and on whether the interest rate will be effective to change something in the economy, so control credit or lead to changes in GDP. So it seems that there is this new discussion, but this is not constrained by the global financial cycle. This is only one of the many variables that affect how the central bank decides its monetary policy, and whether the changes in on the monetary policy by the central bank will have the effect that it desired. So, of course, these are new elements that should be taken into account, but still on the technical part, it seems that the central bank maintains its ability to set the short-term interest rates. And of course, whether these new determinants have an effect or not on the consequences of monetary policy is certainly not because the central bank lost the control over the interest rate. So this is the main conclusion from this theoretical part. And also from this discussion, we can say that the compensation principle seems to be very robust, even if we take into account new contributions on the literature. And therefore, we use this concept, this theoretical approach to analyze the Brazilian economy in the 2000s. So I will shortly present the Brazilian context in this decade. The main point in terms of the institutional arrangement of the Brazilian central bank was that after the 99 exchange rate crisis, there was a change in the way that monetary policy and the exchange rate policies were performed in the country. So the central bank had to break the peg, and therefore it adopted a managed floating exchange rate regime. And since until then, this fixed exchange rate regime was kind of one of the ways by which inflation was being controlled. It had to replace with another tool, which was the inflation targeting regime. So this was the new institutional arrangement, which is still in place now. Nevertheless, this doesn't mean that the central bank stopped intervening on the foreign exchange market. Actually, it still intervened a lot. And this is shown by Candentes and Venengo's foreign exchange intervention statistics. So this statistics goes from 0 to 1. And we see that it was higher before the adoption of the IT regime than after the adoption. But it's not as if after the adoption, the statistics was 0. Actually, there was still a considerable degree of intervention in the foreign exchange market, even after the central bank changed its institutional arrangement. So this was the institutional setting that was the basis of how monetary policy was being performed in the 2000s. And what happened in the 2000s is that there was this high global economic growth motivated especially by Chinese growth after the dot-com bubble in 2001. And this huge commodity boom benefited many countries, in particular those who were selling commodities, such as Brazil. So this was very important for our exports. And it led to recurrent surpluses in the balance of goods and services in the current account. So this was already an inflow of foreign currency to the country that was stimulated by commercial factors. But there was also this more financial side of the process, which was triggered by the expansionary monetary policy in the USA which after 2006 really increased global liquidity, and therefore the forex accumulation in Brazil was even stronger. So this is shown in this graph. We can see that from 2004 to 2006, there was already an increase in the stock of foreign reserves accumulated by the Central Bank of Brazil, but it's really after 2006 until 2011, there is a huge increase in the stock of foreign reserves held by the Brazilian Central Bank. This process kind of ends in 2011, which is associated to basically the reversal of the two factors that were causing this process. So first, the global financial crisis was followed by slower economic growth, and what used to be a surplus in the current account became a deficit. But for a while, it was actually more than covered by the capital inflows that were stimulated by the QE policy in the US. However, after 2012, we also had this reversal of the QE policy. So this is known as the end of the double bonanza period for developing countries, because no longer we had these huge flows of capital due to commercial factors, neither financial factors. So Brazil no longer accumulated foreign reserves, and there was also a change in the strategy by the Brazilian Central Bank, and it intervened way less in the foreign exchange market. Actually, in this period, we started to observe a trend of currency depreciation, and when the central bank intervenes in the foreign exchange market, it's very limited and at very specific points of time. It's not doesn't seem to be a policy anymore, as it was in the 2000s. So to the empirical part, given that there was this huge accumulation of foreign reserves, it becomes a relevant question: what happened to monetary policy? Was monetary policy autonomy restricted by those interventions? And as we said, the compensation principle offers a robust basis to analyze this. It has been tested for economies in Asia and in Europe, and our idea here is to test it for Brazil. In order to test it, we have actually two questions. So one is, has the interest rate been kept at the targeted level? So could the central bank put the interest rate at the level that it wanted? So this was our technical definition of monetary policy independence. And the second question is, has the monetary base responded to changes in the foreign reserves? So was the monetary base the factor that was compensating the increases in the forex? So with respect to the interest rate, it's quite clear from this graph that the targeted and the effective interest rates are basically the same in all the period from 2004 to 2012. The deviations from the target are very small, less than 0.25 percentage points usually. Only in one period it was a bit higher, but never above 1 percentage point. And this suggests that usually those deviations must be within the accepted bands by the central bank, which are not announced. But it does seem that the central bank can control the interest rate and keep it very close to the level that is targeted. With respect to the second question, it is a matter of figuring out which was the item of the central bank that compensated the changes in the foreign reserves. So when it was accumulating foreign reserves, there was an increase in its assets, and the conventional view would have said that it would be the monetary base which would increase due to the increase in the foreign reserves. If we look at the literature on Brazil and Brazilian monetary policy, there's a lot of focus there are many works saying that it was the repos, the most important instrument for monetary policy in Brazil. So what we do in this empirical part is to try to capture empirically whether it was the monetary base that was increasing when there were the increases in the foreign reserves, or whether it was the repos, since this was the most important item for monetary policy in the country. So what we do is to estimate a vacuum model, basically because given that is a relation between two stocks, we assume that there would be a cointegration relation between them. So a vacuum model is appropriate for testing this. And we include in the data set the forex, the monetary base, the treasury account of the central bank, the compulsory reserves, the repos, and GDP, because GDP can be important for how the monetary base dynamics. We estimate the model and then we apply this cointegration test. So we find that there are two cointegration equations, meaning that the whole system seems to be in a cointegration equation, and therefore we can estimate the vacuum model. We estimate the model and we arrive at the impulse response functions that are estimated through the model. So on the right, we have the response of the monetary base to changes in the forex. So applying a shock to the forex, what happened to the monetary base? And here we see that the response is very small and non-significant, whereas on the left, we see that the repos have a very significant response to changes in the forex, and the magnitude is very high. So this is an evidence that the item that was compensating the changes in the forex when the Brazilian Central Bank was intervening in the forex market was the repos. So the monetary base did not increase due to the changes in the forex, and therefore monetary policy autonomy was not restricted. Actually, quite on the contrary, as we saw, the central bank could still set the interest rate at the level that it targeted. So to conclude very quickly, we find empirical evidence of the validity of the compensation principle in Brazil in the 2000s. This means that Brazil had more monetary policy autonomy than the conventional view, which is based on the Monoflaming framework, would have suggested. Nevertheless, it's still important to recognize that external sector issues can influence how the monetary policy authority decides what is the level of the interest rate. So of course, there may be a limit on focusing only on domestic factors, but this is more on the decision level, not on the implementation level, let's say. And some questions still remain open. So sterilization involves the increase of assets being held by the private sector. So there's an important distributive effect here. And also, it's also interesting to investigate whether the compensation thesis also applies to the long-term interest rates, because here we are checking only the short-term ones. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lilian, for your very interesting presentation. We'll have now around 10-15 minutes for Pedro Loseguit's comments, and then we open the floor for additional comments and discussion. Pedro?
Okay, thank you, Germán. Thank you, Lilian. I don't know if you are seeing the presentation.
Yes.
Okay, so it's a very interesting research agenda. I'm not really, we're gonna go over this, but I'm not really very much familiar with the compensation principle and reflux, but I was trying to get close to that. But it was interesting, your summary about, this relationship between the compensation and the Mandel-Fleming and the contrasting between these two theories. The other interesting thing is that it has a very important implication for the actual implementation of the monetary policy. Just in your conclusion, you mentioned that implementation may be not so important. I believe that is really important, and your results show something like that. And then the particular case of Brazil that is actually very interesting for that period. Nowadays for Argentina, and I think that more broadly for other countries. So I will discuss a little bit this. So I don't want to stop that much in this discussion about Mandel-Fleming and compensation principle, because your summary was excellent. But I was, we are, most of us more familiar with the Mandel-Fleming idea of this trilemma or these constraints that small open economies have to conduct independent monetary policy under inflows of foreign money. And it's interesting that the compensation principle gives like a different view, more on a more endogenous reaction, and this thing that basically you end up summarizing this relationship between deposits and credits creating deposits, and deposits creating credit. That it's something interesting. I mean, it's not the first time that in economics we end up having this relationship between supply generating demand or demand generating supply, in something that is actually, at some point, I'm not true in this case, but I wonder if the final result is simultaneous. I mean, there is a lot of research in how, I mean, we published a couple of papers on the interbanking system in Argentina, and when I had the chance to talk with people who actually work in the treasury in banks, they are actually looking for business credit to give or investment to make, and also sometimes they have deposits that they have to allocate, sometimes they have business or investment that they want to make and they need deposits. So it's not always, you know, that they have one way or the other. It's something like more or kind of simultaneous. But anyway, this thing, I believe that it is interesting to analyze in the context of the actual monetary policy implementation by the central bank. So let me go to the, basically I analyzed the paper and actually both of them like have a different, you mentioned that there is a working paper and then there is a paper that we recently published. That's something interesting. First of all, the thing of this exogenous interest rate under inflow of foreign currency, and the central bank targeting an interest rate that we're going to see in the case of Brazil. And then the exogenality of the monetary base under this foreign exchange reserve accumulation. Okay. The case of Brazil, for me, I mentioned that is actually very interesting because of the institutional changes that had were in place, you know, after the currency crisis in '99 and 2003, and then the implementation of this inflation target with foreign exchange managed floating. Okay. The fiscal responsibility law was important, and one aspect of that law is quite interesting, at least for me, that the central bank couldn't issue central bank bonds anymore. You know, and it gave in 2 years the central bank had to replace the central bank bonds and start right over to use repos. To use the treasury bonds, okay? And that is something important because the role of the treasury bonds became much more important in that sense. And that had an interesting effect, not only for the monetary policy, but also for the development of the domestic debt market in Brazil. That was quite impressive during the period that you analyze. And not only for the domestic debt currency market, but also for the interbank market in Brazil. That was quite important. And in that context, the central bank could set the interest rate, the short-term interest rate, I mean, quite I don't know, easy is the word, but in some sense, the market became very deep and quite interesting for the central bank with instruments to implement the monetary policy and to actually affect the short-term interest rate. And then this setting was more or less, the same until you mentioned 2012, more or less, when the period, as you mentioned, I quote you, between 2012 and after that was more uninteresting in terms of the compensation view. Okay, basically the situation changed and the central bank, I don't know if decided the war, but I'm sure that couldn't, it's not the war, but they didn't accumulate more reserve. Okay, and so basically looking at the central bank balance sheet, you put it in the paper and in the presentation, we have like three sources of how to the central bank can create money in the economy, monetary liabilities, the foreign claims on the public sector and claims on the financial sectors. These are the three sources. You analyze this one, and actually there is a paper on Macedonian economy that mentioned that also analyze the compensation view in this context. But there are other sources of how the central bank balance sheet can grow that are not analyzed because it's not the point of your work. But I would like to ask you a question on what do you feel would be the reaction of the compensation view in these other cases, like for instance, Dominican Republic in 2000 with the financial crisis, before Venezuela or other countries, and or with the situation where the public sector is the one that is generating and increasing the central bank balance, as can be the case in our country nowadays. Okay, and also one thing that is important in your case is the interesting role of the treasury account that is different to the case in Argentina, because under all these reforms, you create a unique account for the treasury, and that's an account that became important in some periods for the monetary policy and for the sterilization process. The sterilization is done using the non-monetary liabilities, and this case of Brazil is interesting because in Argentina, we are using the central bank securities to sterilize, I think it is the case in Macedonia as well, in this paper of the compensation view, and that's not really important for the compensation view. It's just implementation of the monetary policy. But it was interesting that in the case of Brazil, the central bank during all this period couldn't, issue bonds, so securities, central bank securities. So they had to use the treasury bonds, the repos, and they were very efficient in doing that. So basically, for your empirical approach, basically the question is if this accumulation of foreign exchange reserves had a relationship with the central bank liabilities, but with which one of them? I mean, the monetary liabilities or the non-monetary liabilities? And so you already explained the strategy. Actually, it's a little bit different to the one that I'm describing here because it's a second paper, but it's the result is the same. And basically, you find that in the long run, the increase in foreign reserves, I mean, in this source of the asset, is not related with these monetary liabilities that would, as you mentioned, probably or generate inflation or affect the interest rate or whatever. But yes, it is with the non-monetary liabilities. In your case, with the repos, okay, because that was those were the instrument that the central bank used. Okay, so basically, this long-run relationship gives an idea that at least the central bank was able to generate something. I mean, because when you receive foreign reserves that are coming into your country, I mean, the central bank is managing the exchange rates. It's going to buy the excess dollars, and then it's going to have to issue monetary liabilities. But then the central bank, as you mentioned in the paper, that's short run, and then immediately the central bank would sterilize, or the sterilization would be automatic, as you mentioned in the compensation view. So basically, the result shows that that process happened. Okay, whether it was the central bank successful or whether it was just endogenous. So basically, my concern, as you can see from my presentation, is that I'm not really convinced that the process was endogenous. Okay, it's a short period of time. The relationship is there, but I believe that the central bank had the instruments to do that sterilization process. But I'm sure that the period that you analyze is really interesting. Okay. But basically, my questions are related to that conclusion that I have. Basically, if you think that the implementation of the monetary policy was key in these results, and you mentioned in the second paper that you try to analyze 2012 and beyond. There was a change there in different dimensions. One of them is that this sterilization process is not cheap, it's not free for central banks, and in the end, and that has to do with the institutional arrangement as well. The Central Bank of Brazil had some problem with the network. And had to be capitalized in some period. And that was related with the fact that they had a lot of foreign assets, and changes in the exchange rate would change the result of that. But that was also maybe, or can be analyzed as a possible cost of this sterilization process. If this is endogenous, how can we explain that? Then the other thing is that for the period that we analyze until 2011 or so, the GDP economic growth was interesting in Brazil and had an important effect on the total debt as a percentage of GDP. And that's something that you control for in the paper that I would like to discuss a little bit, because how this relates with the network losses of the central bank in the period. And then, as I mentioned before, your view is related with the two sources of potential increase in liquidity on the asset side of the central bank. That will be all my comments, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pedro. We would like to react, Lilian, to Pedro's comments before we open for additional questions by the other participants.
Yes, well, first of all, thank you very much for the very careful reading of the paper, and also for bringing details that I didn't bring in my own presentation. So there were many interesting things while you were talking that I was taking notes, but I will try to focus more on your conclusion, right? So your point was that maybe this process was not so endogenous as we are selling it, let's say. And I think here, of course, if you're accepting the compensation view, it will always be automatic. And of course, we are coming from this side. And if someone else is accepting more the dilemma or the trilemma view, they would say, oh no, the central bank was always performing sterilized interventions by a policy of sterilization. I think that the answer that would like favor the compensation view is that even theoretically within the trilemma view, sterilization is not seen as effective, neither sustained. So we are talking about a period of more than 8 years. It would be hard to argue that this was a very successful policy in a framework that says that it wouldn't be an effective for so long. So I think this kind of provides evidence in favor of, yes, this process was automatic, because once the banks were having those reserves, they were actually getting rid of them by buying assets from the central banks. So it was because the central banks were starting this process. In the end of the day, if we look at the data, it's hard to say whether it's a policy of sterilization or if it's automatic, because you don't have data saying that. But I think from the theoretical debate, you could argue that it was something being done automatically because the banks had those reserves that they didn't need to use. And I think if I got right what you were talking about, the implementation of monetary policy, of course, the implementation is key here, because it's by implementing the monetary policy and by defending the targeted level of the interest rates that the central banks act more in a passive way and accept those changes of reserves with the private banks. So the central banks, by defending the targeted interest rate, they sell those assets to the banks, and this helps to keep the interest rate on the targeted level. So of course, there is some action of the central bank, but it's because it's defending the targeted interest rate that is doing so. So there is, of course, an interaction with the central bank. And why this wasn't so important after 2012? I think the main thing is, you mentioned some other factors. I wouldn't say that they were the most important. Maybe they also played a role in some sense, but I think the most important factor was that after 2012, there were no inflows anymore to Brazil. So actually, let's say that we had the same scenario and the central bank had stopped intervening. What we would have observed is an appreciation of the domestic currency. What we did observe was a depreciation. So the type of intervention that would have been required at that time would have been to sell foreign exchange reserves. And it's very different, one thing from another. It's easier to buy reserves than to sell them. And I'm not only saying because there's a limit to selling reserves, like it's limited by the stock that you have, but also because it's politically hard to sell those reserves. It was something that it took us so long to build. It's also something that maybe prevents a lot of speculation on Brazil, because we have that big stock that is saying, okay, we have foreign reserves. And then when do we start to sell them? How much do we sell? It's very difficult. This is a very difficult debate. And many times in the last few years, in certain periods, they sold some of the reserves. It wasn't enough to control the increase in the exchange rate. So there was also some criticism towards that. So it's much more difficult, I think, when it's in terms of selling the reserves. And I think this was one of the key reasons why the process stopped. And I think I maybe lost one or the other point, maybe the third question, but yeah.
No, it's okay. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Excellent.
Thank you, Lilian. We now open the floor for additional questions or comments by the other participants. So we'll ask you to raise your virtual hands or write in the chat. Sebastián.
Okay, thanks, Lilian, for your interesting presentation, and thanks, Germán. Lilian, only to understand, I would like to know what's your opinion about the worries of all policymakers in Brazil. For example, I remember the Minister of Economy, Mantega, talking in the same vein of, for example, Raghuram Rajan from the Central Bank of India about the currency wars or the problems to try to stop capital inflows and the difficulties, I understand, to make an independent monetary policy. If the I don't know what's your opinion about such a worry if the compensation principle works as you mentioned. And the other point that I have to try to understand is that in your, I don't know what's your opinion about other potential, I would say, issues of dominance over monetary policy, because here we are talking, as Pedro pointed very clearly, about issues related with, I would say, external dominance over monetary policy or potential dominance over monetary policy coming from the external sector. But in Brazil and in many countries, but in Brazil, there are some channels of potential financial dominance over monetary policy coming from, for example, from the side of an important domestic debt and some potential limits on the manipulation or managing of interest rates, because issues about sustainability. Okay, I would like to understand how do you put the compensation principle taking into account both issues?
Okay. Should I answer now already?
We shall collect a couple of additional questions and then you can answer again.
Okay.
Ariel.
Hi, Lilian. Thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. I have two questions. One is more theoretically oriented. The other one has to do with your empirical request. The first one is that when you were discussing the sort of independence discussed by Ray and the dilemma, you were saying that, I quoted what you wrote in your presentation, the monetary policy is not actually independent because it's limited by the monetary rate set by the USA. As far as I understand, this is also the case within the compensation view. I mean, you cannot, I mean, you have several constraints to set the interest rate below the target rate set by the Fed, or I mean, the higher currency monetary policy. And the second one, related to the empirical investigation, my question is whether you could find, I mean, we're able to find the same compensation principle applying when you have losses of reserves, because in that case, not only you are expected to, I mean, you would be expecting to find the opposite situation, losing reserves and losing central bank securities or something like that. But I was, depending on the magnitude of the outflow, you were also expecting to find some sort of crisis that would dirty, in a sense, the relationship between these two stocks. So have you done something like that? Are you expecting to do something like that? Thank you.
Okay, Lilian, would you like to react to this question?
Yeah. Thank you very much for the questions. So with respect to the two first questions, with respect to this concern with, oh, it's difficult to stop capital inflows, I think the answer from the compensation view, and of course, in reality, everything is much more complicated than what a theory says. So having that in mind, the answer would be that it's not such a big problem, because if you have capital inflows, you don't have a limit to intervene in the foreign exchange market and control the exchange rate. However, I think in the context that you were referring to, there was such a large capital inflow that the currency appreciated considerably in Brazil. So if it's not as if the Brazilian central bank here the term matters a lot, but it didn't want to keep a fixed exchange rate. It just wanted to reduce the extent to which the currency appreciated in that period. So it was able to do that as much as it wanted, but maybe doing it to keep the exchange rate fixed, it was more complicated also politically. So, and also we have to keep in mind that an appreciated currency really helps the central bank to achieve the inflation target. So it was actually quite helpful in that sense. So, but I think from the compensation principle point of view, the main problem is really when there is a reduction in the reserves, because this is a limit itself, and we will get to that also. And with respect to this dominance over monetary policy, I think also even with respect to Pedro's comments, the way the compensation view sees money and the way that endogenous money is, this theory is formed, is that, okay, even if you have increasing debt in the government, if the banks are left with reserves that they don't want, they will get rid of them, and then the monetary base will not necessarily increase. So this is how everything that happens in the balance sheet of the banks, the central banks and the banks, is seen, and this is the answer that they have to provide. What I think is important is that one thing is this more theoretical and technical relationship, which is described by the balance sheet and then has implications for the interest rate, the actual interest rate. Something very different is whether, for instance, having this debate about, oh, will Brazil be able to repay its debt that is on domestic currency? Theoretically, there shouldn't be such a large debate about this, but right now, with the change in the government, there is. And this, of course, may be one of the variables that are entering the meeting of the central bank when they decide whether they would change the interest rate or not. So we are not saying that the central bank is setting the interest rate in a vacuum. That's not the point. Of course, there are many, many, many political things, and maybe those are the most important ones. What is interesting is to say, well, since it's a political process, it's also a choice. So whether you choose to increase the interest rate given in a certain situation, it's because you chose it. It's not because there was something automatic making your interest rate increase. And if you chose it, you could choose something else. The degree of your choice is also subject to discussion. So I think this is really, from my side at least, I think when we were writing the paper, our co-authors had different views on this, but what I took from this debate is really that it is a political choice, therefore it's open for debate. And this goes to the two following questions also. I think, strictly speaking, in terms of the compensation principle, the only limit to reducing the interest rate below the level set by the USA would be the amount of foreign reserves that you have. So you would lose the reserves until eventually you would have to adopt a flexible exchange rate regime. So even in those terms, you could still maintain the interest rate different, but you would have to give up controlling the exchange rate because you don't have foreign reserves any longer. So from the theoretical side, that is the answer that the compensation view would provide. I think when we look at how things are done in practice, of course, this would be a concern. So I think it's very hard to argue that Brazil could have an interest rate that is below the one from the USA. But the point is, how much above does it have to be? And I think this is where the debate is, and this is again where these political considerations have a very key role to play. And also similarly, well, if it's losing reserves, of course there is a crisis, but again, the difference is in terms of giving up on controlling the exchange rate, not in terms of what the Trilemma View would say is that you lost control of your monetary policy. So this is the key distinction. There is, of course, this limit when you lose reserves, which is why also maybe it was more interesting to evaluate when Brazil was accumulating reserves, because there wasn't such a limit at the time. But in terms of how the theory is framed, it's, well, the central bank has to give up controlling the exchange rate, which is what happens many times actually also. So yeah, I think for those comments, it's that.
Do we have some additional questions? Have convinced most of the participants because there are no more questions. Well, then let me to finish this activity to thank again Lilian for these excellent discussions that we have had. That will be all for this year of academic seminars. We hope that you join us in our forthcoming events next year. Cambio al español. Agradecemos a todos y todas por haber participado y nos estamos viendo el próximo año. Gracias.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lilian.
You're welcome. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you, Lilian. Excellent.
Thank you,
Enzo.
Pedro. Thank you, Gerioni.